Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out my video. Today I'm going to be talking about the brand new Sony ZV-1. This is a camera that Sony has released just for vloggers, and there are already a ton of reviews on YouTube, and if you've seen any of them you will notice that almost everyone complains about the same three problems. Number one is that the focal length on this camera at the widest setting, which is 24 millimeters, is still too tight for vlogging. Number two is that the stabilization in this camera is still not that great. And if you enable the stabilization, you will see that the image crops in even further. So you are more like at the 30 millimeter. And number three is that the battery in this camera is still the exact same NP battery from the Sony RX100 line. And in order to address all these problems, I came up with a couple of hacks that I want to show you today. You need to purchase basically two items. In order to address the problem of the narrow field of view and the stabilization, which will crop it even tighter, you will need to purchase a wide angle lens. And this wide angle lens will allow you to have a pretty wide starting point. And if you then enable stabilization, you have a crop still, but the image will be wide enough that you will have enough field of view to get everything in the frame that you want to. And for the second problem, I decided to show you how you can use one of these lipstick size batteries to power your camera as well as your external microphone and not have to worry about any battery life. All right, let me show you how to do all that. At the time this video was created, the new Sony ZV-1 was not available for purchase yet. So I decided to demonstrate these hacks on a camera that has pretty much the exact same problems that the ZV-1 has. This is my RX100 Mark V, and it has almost the same 24mm to 70mm focal length as the ZV-1. The active stabilization on my camera is only available in HD, where the ZV-1 has active stabilization in 4K as well, but the crop factor that the active stabilization adds to the field of view is the exact same crop factor on both cameras. And the RX100 Mark V uses the same battery as the ZV-1. So as soon as you have your ZV-1 in your hands, you will be able to apply the exact same hacks that I'm showing you here on the RX100 Mark V, and you will be good to go. The first thing we need to do is to attach an adapter to the front of the camera. This will allow you to screw on the wide angle lens to get the larger field of view that we need for vlogging. The adapter I got is made out of metal, which ensures that it will last a long time. There are many adapters available on the market, but for my RX100 Mark V as well as your new Sony ZV-1, you will need to buy a 52mm adapter, which will be big enough to avoid any vignetting on the corners of your image. Simply peel off the cover for the sticky tape and make sure that you align the adapter as close to perfect as you can so it won't cover any part of your lens. Once the adapter is installed, you will see that it is barely noticeable and adds almost no weight or bulk to the camera. So now let's get onto the main star of this video. This is a wide angle lens made by the company Zoom. They are based in China and have been making lenses for quite a while. When I researched wide angle lenses for the RX100 as well as the ZV-1, I also came across other lenses, but they were just incredibly large and heavy. I wanted to use a lens with the smallest footprint possible, but even this lens is still pretty large. The good thing about this lens, however, is that it is made of very good materials and feels rock solid. The lens screws onto the adapter with no issues whatsoever, and the final result is pretty impressive. We have now finally converted our vlogging camera to one with a much wider field of view, which will give us a lot more possibilities. The new Sony ZV-1 as well as my RX100 Mark V have a 24mm field of view at the widest setting. However, this wide angle lens, which has a crop factor of 0.45, basically gives us a field of view of roughly 10.8mm, which is fantastic. The new ZV-1 has a hot shoe mount, which allows you to power external microphones, which is awesome. Some of the best microphones for vlogging is this one called the ECM XYST1M, which is a stereo microphone that allows you to adjust the angle of the left and right microphone to point them forward for interviews or to the side to capture more of your surroundings. Another great microphone, especially for a small camera like the ZV-1, is this Bluetooth microphone called the ECM-W1M. However, using any of these microphones will cause even bigger problems to your camera's battery life than the tiny NP batteries already do. Now let's address the problem of the poor battery life in the Sony ZV-1 and my RX100 Mark V. I'm going to show you two ways on how you can finally solve this problem. The first one, which is the simple approach, is to use a battery grip instead of a regular tripod. The battery grip I'm using is from the company VidPro and it has a capacity of 6000 milliamps, which is almost 5 times the battery life of a single NP battery. This allows you to power your camera through the micro USB port and should give you enough power for both your camera and your microphone for the entire day. One thing I would recommend you buy if you choose to power your camera via the micro USB port is a cage as well as a cable lock clamp to protect the micro USB port. This cage right here is for my RX100 Mark V, and because the ZV-1 has just been released, there are no cages available yet. But once a company like SmallRig or NiceRig makes a cage, you should get one. The cable lock clamp I recommend is from the company NiceRig, and this will protect your micro USB port from getting damaged. First, you attach the cage to your camera to have additional mounting points for the clamp. Then you screw on the battery grip to the bottom of your cage and make sure that the USB port from the battery grip is facing the same side as the micro USB port from the camera. Next, you screw the cable lock clamp onto the cage adjacent to the micro USB connection on the camera. Choose a micro USB cable that is only about 7 inches in length in order to avoid getting the cable caught up in anything. Connect the micro USB cable to the camera first and then adjust and tighten the cable lock clamp to ensure it is snug. Then connect the cable to the power bank and make sure to click on the small button in the power bank to activate the charging. We can see that the power button on the camera lights up, which indicates that it is charging. If you don't see it lit up, then go into your camera settings and enable USB charging. So this is the first vlogging rig for your new ZV-1. This setup addresses 2 out of the 3 problems this camera has, which is the narrow field of view as well as the poor battery life. If you want to keep the setup a little bit smaller and lighter, you can skip the cage and the cable lock clamp, but you will need to be very careful not to bang up the micro USB port. The Sony ZV-1 is also going to be offered in a bundle which includes a Bluetooth grip which allows you to control your camera wirelessly. However, there are 2 problems with this grip. First, it does not include a built-in power bank, so you cannot plug it into your camera on the fly when you run out of battery. Second, the 1/4-inch mount on the bottom of the camera is so close to the battery compartment that you are unable to access it while the grip is still attached. I don't want to unscrew the grip every time I need to change the battery, so I'm going to show you the ultimate way you should build your vlogging rig when using the ZV-1 camera for vlogging. In order to build the ultimate vlogging rig for the Sony ZV-1, we need a cylinder-shaped power bank like this Anker lipstick size power bank, which has a capacity of 3350 milliamps, which is about 3 times the size of the NP battery. You need to purchase this type of clamp, which is called a wire loom clamp. This clamp is available at hardware stores like Home Depot or Lowe's. You will need 2 1/4-inch male to 1/4-inch male screw adapters. Next, you will need 1 1/4-inch 20 coupling nut. You will also need 1 rubberized flat washer. The same micro USB cable from the previous hack. And finally, we will need a camera cage to assemble everything together. First, you screw one of the 1/4-inch male adapters onto one end of the coupling nut. Then you slide the rubber washer onto the other end of the 1/4-inch male adapter. Install the camera cage onto your camera. Plug in the micro USB cable into your camera. Next, I recommend you install a cable lock clamp to protect the micro USB port. Position the wire loom clamp underneath the cable lock clamp and screw the clamp onto the cage using the screw we built previously. Carefully slide the power bank through the wire loom clamp and make sure it does not stick out too far so you can place your camera on a flat surface. Screw on the second 1/4 inch male adapter onto the other end of the coupling nut. This will make it easier for you to tighten and loosen the wire loom clamp if you want to swap out the power bank. Plug in the other end of the USB cable into the power bank and you are done. Now we have the perfect setup for vlogging. All you need to do now is screw the new Sony wireless Bluetooth grip into the bottom of the cage to be able to control your camera wirelessly. You have a wide angle lens to frame yourself and your surroundings in your shot. You have plenty of power to film in 4K for many hours thanks to the external power bank. And because the power bank is mounted to the right of the camera, it will not block the flip out screen of the ZV-1, which flips out to the left. Next, we are going to go outside to test this wide angle lens, talk about the best way to address the third problem of this camera, which is the stabilization, and we'll wrap up with some of the downsides of this setup as well as my final thoughts. So for the first series of tests, we are going to put the camera onto a tripod and I'm about 2 feet away from the lens. In this first clip, you see the field of view the camera gives you when stabilization is turned off. For my RX100 Mark V and the new Sony ZV-1, this is going to be about 24 mm. We are now going to screw on the wide angle lens to see how much wider our field of view is going to be. What you see now is the field of view you get with the stabilization turned off, so you are at 24 mm, plus the additional wide angle lens with a crop factor of 0.45, which will give you a total field of view of 10.8 mm. You can actually see the plant on the left side of the screen that wasn't visible at all without the lens. However, we can also see that in the very far corners of the lens, the image gets slightly washed out or blurry. I am now going to detach and reattach the lens a couple of times to give you the idea of how this lens will add to your field of view. And last but not least, here's a snapshot without the lens next to a snapshot with the lens, and you can clearly see how much wider the field of view is. One thing we want to check as well is whether or not our face gets distorted when moving to the edge of either side. I was not able to see a clear distortion when looking at the video. Now we are going to do the same test, but this time we will activate the Intelligent Active Image Stabilization. In the RX100 Mark V, we have active stabilization as well as intelligent active stabilization. In the new Sony ZV-1, we only have one stabilization mode, which is active stabilization. However, it has the same crop factor as intelligent active on the RX100 Mark V. So the crop you are seeing now on my RX100 Mark V with intelligent active stabilization is the same you will see on your new Sony ZV-1. As you can see, the shot is already pretty tight from 2 feet away. Here's a comparison between stabilization being turned off, so a 24 mm field of view, and stabilization turned on. In my estimation, the field of view is now about 30 mm. Now we are going to add the wide angle lens to see how much field of view we can get back. If the field of view before was about 30 mm and the wide angle lens with a crop factor of 0.45 will give us a field of view of approximately 13.5 mm. I think we now have a pretty good image that is slightly narrower because of the stabilization, but still wide enough thanks to the wide angle lens. If we look at the corners now, it appears they are not as washed out as before, so maybe the crop of the stabilization crops out the widest part of the view, which is the most blurry. And for comparisons, I am going to detach and reattach the wide angle lens a few times to give you an idea of the difference. And lastly, here's a comparison snapshot for a stabilized view without the lens and with the lens. Okay, so now let's move on to a run and gun vlogging scenario. I'm going to be holding the camera in a comfortable way with my elbow bent, which also allows me to absorb any shakiness of the Z-axis with my elbow when I'm walking around. For this first clip, I have stabilization turned off and no wide angle lens attached. So we are looking at the 24mm field of view, which is way too close for vlogging, and with no stabilization enabled, it is also way too shaky. This is the biggest complaint I hear from other YouTubers who reviewed the Sony ZV-1, which has pretty much the same 24 to 70mm f1.8 lens as my RX100 Mark V. Now I am going to screw on the wide angle lens to see how handheld vlogging looks with this lens. Stabilization is still turned off, so this is the widest field of view we can achieve at about 10.8mm. The field of view is now plenty wide, but as you can see, the footage is way too shaky. However, we will get back to this footage later when we come to the best way for improving stabilization. And again, I'm going to detach and reattach the lens a couple of times to show you how the field of view changes. Now we are going to do a test with the stabilization turned on with no wide angle lens attached. The crop that the stabilization adds to the image makes this field of view look more like 30mm. And this is basically what Sony believes is the best mode for handheld vlogging for the new ZV-1. I think this is totally unusable and many other reviewers have agreed. If you are one of those vloggers who like to give their vlogs a cinematic look by adding the black borders on the top and bottom of your videos while using the active stabilization, this camera just out of the box will definitely not work. Some people say it is not possible to build a camera with a small wide angle lens, but if you take a look at this 16mm f2.8 pancake lens for APS-C cameras, you can tell that it may be possible. However, the image sensor technology between APS-C and pocket cameras is different, so that may be the reason why we haven't seen this yet in a pocket camera. Let's perform our last test by leaving the stabilization turned on and adding the wide angle lens. We now have video that is cropped in by the stabilization, but we are getting some field of view back by using the wide angle lens. The field of view is now about 13.5mm. As I mentioned in the intro, and you may have heard from many YouTubers who have reviewed the ZV-1, the stabilization that Sony puts in these pocket cameras still isn't good enough. Sony claims it is a little bit better on the ZV-1 compared to my RX100 Mark V. However, we will cover the best ways you can stabilize your footage when you use the ZV-1 for vlogging. Here is the field of view you gain from the wide angle lens when stabilization is turned on. For those of you who don't mind stretching out your arm fully while filming yourself, this is your field of view with the stabilization enabled and with the wide angle lens attached. Let's make sure that the wide angle lens will not affect the awesome autofocus system that the ZV-1 has. I performed a few autofocus tests with the RX100 Mark V, and since this lens did not impact the autofocus system at all, I'm going to assume that it will be the same for the ZV-1. The last problem the new ZV-1 has is the stabilization performance itself. We will explore two ways you can stabilize your footage, and they do not involve using a gimbal like the Xeon Crane M2. A gimbal would only be necessary if you wanted to stabilize your footage with no crop whatsoever, but I want my vlogging rig to be as simple and portable as possible. The great thing about the new ZV-1 is that in addition to recording the video footage, it also records the position of the camera while it is filming. This data, which is called the gyro data, can then be used to stabilize your footage using some of Sony's free software. The first software is called Catalyst Browse. It allows you to stabilize your footage automatically using that gyro data, or you can increase or decrease the stabilization manually using a slider. The more stable you want your video to be, the more the software will crop into your footage. The great thing about this is that you can apply different levels of stabilization to different clips. So some clips may not involve any people, so you can crop in further to perfectly stabilize whatever it is you filmed, whereas footage where you filmed yourself may need to have less stabilization applied in order to keep the footage wide enough. The second way of stabilization also involves using software that takes advantage of the gyro data, but this time we are using a phone app called Movie Edit Add-on. This is great for people who want to stabilize their footage on the go and upload it from their phone. However, there are a few issues with this method. Transferring movie files from your camera to your phone via the app is very slow. The app can only render the footage out into 1080p, and at the moment it is unclear if this 1080p footage is downscaled from any 4K footage you recorded, so we don't know if it is higher quality 1080p footage than if the clips were filmed in 1080p from the get-go. The 1080p footage that the app renders will not have the same high quality bitrate that the ZV-1 can record in, so you will not get 1080p with 100 megabits per second that the camera can record. My advice for vlogging with the new Sony ZV-1 is going to be: turn off the in-body stabilization so you have no crop whatsoever from the camera. Add the wide-angle lens to change your field of view to the widest field of view you can achieve, which is 10.8 millimeters. Since you now have a very wide starting point before you begin editing, add stabilization to your videos using Catalyst Browse, and you will end up with a video that has about the same field of view that you would get if you had stabilization turned on in the camera. But the stabilization applied by Catalyst Browse is going to be much superior and your videos much smoother. The wide-angle lens adds some fisheye distortion, however you can easily correct that automatically in editing using software like VFX Suite. The wide-angle lens will not allow you to zoom past above 30 millimeters, which is no big deal to me since I barely ever use my zoom when vlogging. However, you can always unscrew the lens if you need to film something from far away. The lens is pretty heavy. I measured it to be around 86 grams, which is about 3.03 ounces. This weight added to the far end of the lens may stress out the motors over time since they have to work harder every time the lens extends or retracts. So I usually use it only when I know I will be filming myself a lot. The lens is so wide in diameter that you can set the camera flat on the ground, but if you use a cage, this will no longer be a problem. If you want to use this setup on a gimbal, then you may need to add a quick release plate underneath the camera. So now that we are at the end of this video, I wanted to let you know whether or not I'm going to be buying this Sony ZV-1. So I decided to hold off and wait until they either release a ZV-2 with a wider lens, or I'm going to wait for a full frame camera or APS-C camera that has the same gyro stabilization. The Sony a6400 is almost perfect. It has a flip-up screen. You can change lenses. I can put a wide-angle lens on here if I want to. The only problem is that they still have no stabilization, and if Sony were to release a camera like this with the gyro stabilization data being recorded just like in the Sony ZV-1, this would be probably the perfect vlogging camera. All right, thank you so much for checking out this video, and I'll see you in the next one.